more on the QA. So we'll go on to the next question. Which is back sweetening and yeast. Henrik asks, is it easier and better to back sweeten a mead rather than adding enough honey to stall the fermentation? I find it's easier and more consistent on a production scale to go completely dry. It's fairly consistent and has a final specific gravity. And so I know my alcohol levels. And when I add things through them, I know how much sugar through concentrates or additional honey that I'm going to get. I know exactly how much dilution I'm going to get so that I can repeat the same alcohol level. Adding honey to stall the fermentation. So there's a thing a lot of people don't know about that was figured out while people were making port wine. And there's a white paper somewhere, but it's written by this, it's called DELL points, D-E-L-L-E points. And it's 4.5 times your ABV plus your percent residual sugar, so your Brix level, that's your, which is 0.004 specific gravity, every one of those that comes up. So if you have 65 points, the yeast tend to stall out. So that's the reason why how they're able to maintain sweet port, is that when the alcohol gets high enough, they have high residual sugar, but they fortify it. And when the alcohol goes up and you get a multiplier of about 4.5, they'll exceed that 65 points. And at that point, the fermentation stalls. If you're adding honey to stall the fermentation on I guess it's not specific to sweet meads, to session meads. This is more specific to general meads. You can add quite a bit of honey, and you kind of have to do a calculation to know how much ABV you have. It makes it hard to get the higher alcohols because if you're able to step feed, let's say you have a starting gravity of 1090 and you let it go down to 1060 and then add some portion of honey back up to 1090, let it go down to 1060 and keep adding that. You'll keep the alcohol percentage low and the residual sugar will be high. If you let it drop down too far, let's say it started at 1090 and you went through a couple of cycles and you were getting some alcohol and you let it go too far to say like 1020 and then you added more honey to it, that would definitely probably push it into the stall area. I mean, there's a lot of considerations to have whether the pH is affected or things along that line. But generally speaking, I find it a whole lot easier to sweeten a mead. You hear a lot about people talking about raw honey flavor by back sweetening. And it depends on really how far you're back sweetening and whether you get that raw honey flavor. I find if you can get that last little bit of honey and dial it in, and it's still, yeast don't play very fair sometimes. So it's if you're doing it as a one shot, that's one thing. But for the purposes of repeating a recipe, I say it's kind of hard to repeat that. It can be done, but it's not as easy as knowing it goes to dead stop. Recommended yeasts. The good ones that a lot of people have access to are, the champagne yeast, K1V 1116, EC 1118, 1116, 1118. You've got your D47, you've got your 71B. For the wine yeasts, those are the most ubiquitous ones that you might. Cote de Blanc is another one. I've made a lot of beer, and I noticed a lot of beer yeasts have flavor profiles that you might be able to discern. Like a Hefeweizen yeast might be quite a bit different than an English ale yeast, and a clean American ale yeast like California ale yeast. Those all have very specific flavor profiles, and I find that wine yeast tend to have more utilitarian usage. So like 71B has the ability to start processing malic acid and kind of reducing malic acid you find in grapes a lot of times, but if you're doing a sizer, it might be a good one to pick for that. I tend to use 71B on a lot of citrus type of meads. I tend to use D47 for methaglens. I tend to use a lot of champagne yeast for traditionals, because I'm usually for a traditional, I'm trying to showcase the yeast showcase the honey and trying to bring across its true flavors. Berry meads. There's a lot of ones that you don't find at most homebrew stores. You can find it at places like More Winemaking or thebeveragepeople.com. And those would be some of the D ones like D21, D80, D254, and RC212. Those are ones I like to use for various berry ones: blackberry, blueberry, strawberry, raspberry. Kind of switch it up quite a bit. And sometimes I'll take batches, split them, and add one yeast to one fermenter and add another yeast to another fermenter. You'll get some distinct differences. Sometimes they will accentuate acidity or accentuate the tannin levels in certain things. And when you blend them together, you get more complexity out of that. You can also, when you stick them all in the same bucket, it's kind of a race to see which yeast wins. There's no real good correlation on that, and it's not very repeatable in the long run. So while if you're doing it for a one-time usage, it's can be quite useful. And yeast nutrients. So I use a lot of Scott Lab stuff, GoFerm, Fermade K, Fermade O, and in general, diammonium phosphate. So yeast nutrients. We have to follow federal guidelines as a commercial meadery, and you're not necessarily beholden to that as a home mead maker. GoFerm I tend to use to rehydrate dry yeast. So I think the usage is about 1.25 grams per gram of yeast. And I'm generally using between 1 to 2 grams per gallon of yeast. So for a 5-gram sachet, you might use 4 grams of GoFerm. You take the GoFerm, you put it in warm water, typically about 110 degrees, let it sit for 15 minutes. Take your yeast, sprinkle that on top of there, let that hydrate for 15 minutes. Take some of your must, put that in there for about 5 minutes till you see it start bubbling up. That's called proofing. And from that point, and what that does is actually, since it's warm in there while it's absorbing nutrients from the GoFerm, it will bring the temperature down if you've already started cooling your must so it doesn't get thermal shock and you lose quite a bit of your yeast through thermal shock. Fermade K is more like vitamins, I think, vitamins and minerals. It's got thiamine in it and some other fun things in it. DAP is basically straight nitrogen. A lot of people might just use straight nitrogen. The problem is if you use it too early in fermentation, it can actually stress the yeast and burn them. Burn, I put in quotes. So I use that somewhat, probably no more than 3 grams per gallon for the overall dosage. I do use Fermade O, which is, I think Fermade O and GoFerm are kind of similar products, at least by the look of them. They're kind of a yellow-orange color. DAP is this crystalline, white crystalline powder, and Fermade K tends to be more of a kind of a gray-orange powder. But I use a combination of all of them. Like I said, we're limited on the amount of Fermade K that we use. We're limited on how much DAP we can use, but we're not limited on how much Fermade O that we're able to use. The final one here is adding tannins and et cetera, and why. So yeast is not a nutrient wasteland, but it tends to not have any structure to it. It does have one organic acid, which is gluconic acid, but I tend to add other acid components to it. So the options are generally tartaric, malic, or citric acid. I tend to use a lot more tartaric than I use either malic or citric acid. If I do something with citrus in it, I probably split between tartaric and citric acid. If I'm doing a sizer, I might add tartaric and malic acid. The tannins are there for mouthfeel. So the problem with, I guess, mead is as you make lower ABV meads, that the body of the mead is strongly correlated with the amount of residual sugar that's left in the mead. So tannins are kind of a useful thing. You might use anywhere from what's the numbers? 1/16 of a teaspoon up to a half a teaspoon per gallon of tannins. I mean, it's kind of going to depend on what your bench trials tell you works well. A lot of honeys might have more acidity, less acidity, and there's going to be a certain balance. When I do my judging of meads, I find that a lot of people find the acidity to be what they think is comfortable, but if you bench trial and take a small amount, and if you get a small little baggie of tartaric acid and you do a small little sprinkle inside of that, that you might find, oh, it brightens up the flavor of the mead. Same thing with the tannins. You might notice a structure. Like if you have a bold, dry red wine, you can tell it's not just dry, the fact of lack of sugar, but there's usually a structure, almost like there's wood that you can, like licking a plank of wood or something along that line. For me, it makes my tongue feel like it's raspy, almost like the feeling a cat's tongue has. And it makes more of a more pleasurable experience for the overall balance of the mead. I find a lot of home mead makers they're happy with the gluconic acid, but I feel probably 80% of them that I try don't have enough acid. The gluconic acid, I find, kind of manifests itself on the back of the palate, and there's tend to be nothing around the edges of the tongue, or especially on the tip of the tongue. People will use acid blends, and that has all three. It has tartaric, malic acid, and citric acid. And you could use it, but people kind of go overboard with it a bit. Typical dosages, I tend to do in grams per liter, and it might be anywhere from 0.1 gram per liter up to 0.4 gram per liter. A lot of my recipes, I'm kind of using acids somewhere in that range, and each one kind of varies for which one I do. A lot of these, for me, I have a prescribed recipe for our draft meads, and I add my tannins on that one up front. The acids, depending on how the fruit comes across, I will have a small amount of variability, but I kind of have standardized amounts that I add, and I almost always add those at post and just for flavor. So Robert asks, do you need acids if your meat is flavorful all over the tongue without it? It's not necessarily. I would still say you would just bench trial it. Again, pull a small sample from what you think you're ready to go, and just take a small pinch. Like, let's say you have a small wine glass, then you fill it up like a third full, and all you're really looking for is, does a small pinch or a double pinch or a triple pinch improve that? Now, what that number means as far as like doing a calculation to bring it up, that's kind of going to depend more on what your personal tastes are. So what is flavorful? It kind of depends on your own personal thing. You just might find a difference in it. So I see people, I've read over the past that some people say add acid and wait for a while. If it's mixed well, I find it kind of changes the profile pretty quickly. It's same thing with tannins. It kind of doesn't really. Tannins may take a little while to integrate because they're kind of a powder thing, but acids kind of integrate pretty quickly with some mixing that doesn't involve adding oxygen or making kind of like a vortex. You want to like not really disturb the surface so much as just get it down in there and get the fluids swirling around and you adding that. So to answer why, it's more about balance. To me, balance is a big thing. You're balancing sweetness, alcohol, tannins, acid, and sometimes fruitiness, which I'll kind of put into the sweetness level. And with, a three-legged table doesn't stand very flat. It doesn't stand very balanced. So as you add each one of these, you might find that the balance overall, you might have a very high alcohol, dry mead that is just straight up tastes like boozy fusel alcohols, and there's no body to it at all. And I've heard from people before say balance is often synonymous with, just more residual sugar. Residual sugar is probably the easiest way to fix problems, with maybe acid being the second easiest way. Most of the time your alcohol is determined, and whether it's hot and fiery alcohol or just kind of low, a low signature, you may or may not have to add certain things. So it's kind of just a personal balance on what that means. But once you have a good balanced mead, it's a whole lot easier to see that. I know a lot of people who are just starting making mead, it's kind of unknown what it means, but I'm a big proponent of bench trialing. So hopefully that's enough answers for this. Well, Michelle has a question. How do you feel about oaking a mead to add tannins? I think it's great. For the most part, I tend to use spirals and cubes, I used to boil, I use cubes probably more than anything. I used to boil my cubes to get rid of, and then discarding the water, and then boil it for like 30 seconds and get the water-soluble tannins out. So you get kind of the softer ones that integrate better, and as the meat integrates. I think 2 ounces of cubes per 5 gallons is kind of a neutral barrel, and 4 ounces per gallon of cubes. And that's probably for anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks of sitting there. It's more like a new barrel. I've certainly put in way too many oat chips into a mead, and it was basically like drinking a peg leg that are just an oat table leg. It was just way too much. But it adds a certain kind of structure. So as far as tannins, the ways you can add them, you can use black teas. You can use grape tannins from the homebrew store. You can use oak tannins. You can use oak cubes. You can use white wine tannins, which are extracted from tree gall. And the white wine tannins tend to be a lot softer and almost kind of a slicker mouthfeel. They give structure, but it's kind of different than grape skin tannins or oak tannins, which tend to make things a little bit more raspy, but it does add a lot more structure. James asks, James got a question, but I think we're about to hit that question here soon. I'm not sure what order we have here. In fact, it's the next one. This is from